This week we start Chapter 8 on rocks and weathering. And as I mentioned, although not as exciting as things like earthquakes and volcanoes, this is something that we see in everyday life around here, and so hopefully it makes a little more sense. Um, you read these pages, Chapter 8, Section 1, and should have chosen one of these three things. Either answer key concept questions at key concepts as you read, key terms along the way, or key concept questions at the end. What we're going to do is do our 5-minute flip lesson and take a look at the overview, the most important things. So here are some of the words that were in the chapter, some important words we need to know. First of all, weathering. Weathering, pretty straightforward. The forces of weather that break down rocks. So what forces of weather might cause this breaking down of rocks? So as we look at a bigger picture, maybe we change it to forces of nature. We could have rain, gravity, wind, storms, heat and cold, ice. All of these things are going to break down rocks. So let's look at a couple other factors here. Erosion, which we'll talk about a lot more next week. Most people are more familiar with erosion than weathering. Erosion technically is when those broken down parts get moved somewhere else. And so next week we'll talk about erosion and deposition, those little parts, rock being broken down into smaller rocks, and sand and grit and dust is getting moved. And so that's technically erosion. So we'll talk about it a little more next week. Now, check out this big, huge, annoying word. Uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism. It's actually a very simple concept, but a really big word. So, uniformitarianism. Simply, this means that processes like weathering and erosion that affect the Earth's surface today have always occurred and shaped the Earth's surface in the past. And this is one of those things we have to do in science sometimes, is come up and say, with these really obvious things, and say, we all agree that flooding and rain and ice wedging and wind, these things have always happened. And that has caused the areas that we have now. So in order to say yes, if we see an area of sand dunes, then likely that was an area that had this sort of erosion, or that in desert area like Moab, those areas of those sculpted arches and that sort of stuff is because of sand blowing around in the wind causing abrasion. We have to be able to say, okay, these things that happen now have always happened. We agree to that, then we can say if we see these landforms, we know these things happened. So that's uniformitarianism. The weathering is uniform over time. Okay, so then quickly we talked at the beginning about chemical change and physical change, which is mechanical. So weathering changes the Earth's surface, making things like sand dunes, canyons, things like that. And then let's take a look at some examples of mechanical weathering and chemical weathering. So this is a physical change, just things physically breaking down into smaller pieces but staying the same stuff. And then a chemical change where it's actually turning into a different material. So let's give some examples of each of these. So here in Colorado, rocks, so defined as being broken into smaller pieces. The freeze-thaw ice wedging, this is what causes potholes in the ground. This is what causes large pieces of rocks to fall into the canyons. Here in Colorado, our sunny days and cold nights creates this constant cycle of melting and freezing and melting, freezing. Lots of mechanical weathering. There's another type of mechanical weathering that we get here a little more in areas like Utah, but we get it here too. It's something called abrasion. Abrasion is basically sandblasting. We get a lot of wind here, especially in like in the spring, in January, when that wind picks up a little bit of gravel off the dirt, gravel and dirt off the ground, and then blows it against you. That's that type of sandblasting. It erodes. It's like sandpaper basically, and it erodes buildings and windshields and other rocks. And so this is basically like sandpaper. And in fact, one way they actually can clean buildings is by sandblasting, um, which is essentially doing this on purpose. You can see what I'm writing. Okay, and then chemical weathering. What was the last one there? What's that? Oh, and then animals. Animals are interesting because animals dig holes, and that can cause erosion too. And that would obviously be, most of the time, it would be mechanical. And then chemical change, the biggest thing we're going to have here, so this is when it's actually changing. It's changing form. It's disintegrating. The biggest example we have here is rusting. Or, more generally, we call it oxidation. So basically, this is when water and then water plus oxygen, and then it actually literally breaks down the metal. When metal rusts, it will actually eat away the metal, and the metal will fall apart. When copper statues oxidize, they turn that turquoise color, the metal starts falling apart. We will come back to a few more examples of these tomorrow, but that is your flipped 5 for today.